Picture a medieval monk who spent 8 hours copying biblical text, his back aching and fingers cramped, suddenly sketching a knight locked in mortal combat with a giant snail in the margin, or drawing a monkey playing bagpipes while defecating, all this in a holy book meant for church services. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how medieval scribes filled the margins of holy text with battling knights and snails, naughty jokes and bizarre creatures. We'll discover why monks who spent their days copying scripture also drew monkeys playing bagpipes and rabbits executing humans. Examine how these doodles reveal medieval humour, social commentary, and daily frustrations, and learn what marginalia meanings, scriptorium culture, bestiary symbolism, and the surprisingly human side of medieval manuscript production tell us about the men and women who created these remarkable books. They called them drolleries, from the French word drôle meaning funny or odd, though marginalia encompasses far more than humour. These drawings and notes added to the margins of manuscripts range from serious scholarly annotations to obscene jokes, from pointing hands guiding readers to bizarre hybrid creatures defying nature's laws. Far from being mere doodles by bored scribes, marginalia served multiple functions: teaching aids, memory devices, social commentary, and yes, entertainment. Understanding these marginal additions requires us to abandon modern notions of books as pristine objects and recognize medieval manuscripts as living documents, constantly evolving through use, filled with the personalities of their creators and readers. The medieval book was an expensive object, a luxury item that could cost as much as a small farm. Creating a single manuscript required the skins of dozens of animals for parchment, months or years of skilled labour, and precious materials like gold leaf and ultramarine pigment ground from lapis lazuli. Yet, in these astronomically expensive religious texts, we find drawings of people mooning the reader, nuns harvesting penises from trees, and clerics with animal heads engaged in decidedly unholy activities. This apparent contradiction, sacred text surrounded by profane images, has puzzled scholars for generations and delighted anyone fortunate enough to page through these manuscripts. Medieval marginalia falls into several categories, each serving different purposes. Grotesques and drolleries, fantastic creatures and humorous scenes populated the margins with visual entertainment. Bas de page scenes, literally bottom of the page, often depicted secular activities. Peasants working fields, knights jousting, musicians performing. Line fillers prevented blank spaces where devils might enter, according to medieval belief. Border decorations could be purely ornamental or carry complex symbolic programs. Manicules, pointing hands, directed attention to important passages. Nota bene marks flagged significant text. Corrections and glosses clarified or amended the main text. Ownership marks identified the book's possessor. Reader responses ranged from pious prayers to bawdy jokes. Even pen trials, practice strokes testing a newly cut quill, sometimes evolved into elaborate drawings. The most famous and puzzling of all marginalia themes is the knight versus snail combat. Across Europe, from England to Poland, medieval manuscripts contain images of armoured knights battling giant snails. Sometimes the knight flees in terror. Sometimes he attacks with lance lowered. Occasionally the snail appears to be winning. These images appear in psalters, books of hours, breviaries, the most sacred texts of medieval Christianity. Scholars have proposed numerous theories to explain this bizarre iconography. Some suggest the snails represent the Lombards. Others see resurrection symbolism in the creature that carries its home. More recent interpretations connect the imagery to social tensions, perhaps the slow-moving snail mocking the proud knight's pretensions, or representing the bourgeoisie's gradual economic triumph over the nobility. The geographic distribution of snail combat imagery suggests this wasn't random humour, but a widespread cultural phenomenon. The motif appears most frequently in Gothic manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly in northern France, Flanders, and England. The consistency of the imagery, always knights, always snails, always in combat or flight, indicates shared meaning among medieval viewers. Yet that meaning remains frustratingly elusive to modern scholars. What seems clear is that medieval audiences found something significant, perhaps subversive, in the image of a heavily armed warrior confronting a humble garden pest. Understanding marginalia requires understanding scriptorium culture, the conditions under which these manuscripts were produced. Medieval scriptoria were not the peaceful, contemplative spaces we might imagine, but busy workshops filled with the scratch of quills, the whisper of turning pages, and occasional outbursts of frustration. Monks and secular scribes worked in cold rooms. Fire posed too great a risk to precious manuscripts. They hunched over angled desks for hours, straining their eyes in dim light, developing what they called scribe's palsy, from gripping their pens. Winter brought chilblains and stiff fingers. Summer brought flies and sweat that could ruin pages. The physical discomfort of copying appears directly in marginalia. Scribes left complaints in margins. "Thank God, it will soon be dark." "Oh, my hand, the parchment is hairy." This page was written very slowly, or the exhausted, "For Christ's sake, give me a drink." One Irish scribe wrote an entire poem about his cat Panguban, comparing their parallel hunts, the cat for mice, the scribe for the right word. These marginal notes humanize the copying process, reminding us that behind every medieval manuscript lay hours of physical labor by individuals with aching backs and tired eyes. Manuscript production was often collaborative, with different specialists handling text, decoration, and illumination. The scribe copied the text, leaving spaces for decorated initials and illustrations. Rubricators added red headings and paragraph marks. Illuminators painted miniatures and decorated letters. Finally, marginal artists, sometimes the same people, sometimes specialists, added the drolleries and grotesques. This division of labour explains why marginalia sometimes seems disconnected from the main text. A scribe copying Jerome's biblical commentary might have no say in what images filled the margins of his carefully copied text. The humour in medieval marginalia ranges from gentle whimsy to shocking obscenity. Scatological jokes abound, people defecating, animals with human buttocks, figures farting at each other. Sexual imagery appears even in religious manuscripts. Exposed genitals, copulating couples, phallic creatures. Role reversals provided endless amusement. Rabbits hunting humans, mice chasing cats, students beating teachers. Clerical satire mocked the very institutions producing these books. Fat monks, lecherous friars, proud bishops received the marginalia artists' scorn. Visual puns and word games required literacy to appreciate, suggesting educated audiences for these jokes. Modern viewers often express shock at finding such imagery in religious manuscripts, but medieval audiences had different boundaries between sacred and profane. The same culture that produced soaring cathedrals also celebrated carnival, where social rules temporarily inverted. The Feast of Fools saw lower clergy mockingly elect a boy bishop. Mystery plays mixed biblical stories with crude humour. This wasn't seen as disrespectful, but as part of the fullness of creation. God made everything, including bodily functions and sexual desires. Excluding these from representation would be denying part of divine creation. The influence of bestiaries, medieval encyclopedias of real and imaginary animals, pervades marginalia. Bestiary creatures provided a ready vocabulary of symbolic meaning. The pelican piercing its breast to feed its young with blood represented Christ's sacrifice. The unicorn, captured only by a virgin, symbolized both Christ and chastity, but marginalia artists freely adapted and invented, creating hybrid monsters unknown to any bestiary. Human-headed birds, dog-headed fish, creatures that were half knight, half snail populated the margins. These hybrids might carry specific meaning or simply showcase the artist's imagination. Social commentary fills medieval margins. Peasants appear frequently, usually working, ploughing, harvesting, threshing, providing a documentary record of agricultural techniques. But sometimes they're shown at leisure, dancing, drinking, playing games. Craftsmen appear at their trades, blacksmiths hammering, weavers at looms, merchants haggling. Musicians perform with an astounding variety of accurately depicted instruments. These scenes preserve details of daily life, often absent from written records. They also reveal social tensions, images of peasants defeating knights in combat, or foxes preaching to geese congregations subverted established hierarchies, if only in marginal spaces. The tension between religious text and secular marginalia has generated much scholarly debate. Some argue the playful margins provided relief from serious spiritual content, like coffee breaks during intense work. Others see marginalia as meditation aids, their strangeness shocking readers into attention. Still others interpret the grotesques as representations of vice, contrasting with the virtue promoted in the text. Medieval theologians occasionally justified marginal imagery as showing the diversity of God's creation, or illustrating the temptations faithful Christians must resist. Yet some manuscripts show evidence of later censorship, offensive images scraped away or painted over by scandalized users. Certain manuscripts stand out for their extraordinary marginalia. The Luttrell Psalter, created for a Lincolnshire landowner around 1340, contains hundreds of marginal scenes depicting agricultural life, fantastic creatures, and the patron's family. Its margins provide an unparalleled visual encyclopedia of 14th century English rural life. The Gorleston Psalter features some of the finest and funniest marginal art, including the famous rabbit funeral, where rabbits solemnly carry a dead hunter to his grave. The recently discovered Macclesfield Psalter revealed a treasure trove of previously unknown marginalia when freed from private collection obscurity. Legal texts often featured particularly subversive marginalia. The Smithfield Decretals, containing church law, includes margins filled with foxes dressed as bishops, apes as judges, and other satirical takes on legal authority. Perhaps scribes copying dry legal texts felt more freedom to comment visually on the content they transcribed. Romance manuscripts show different marginal programs, often illustrating the adventures described in the text or adding parallel stories in the margins. Scientific manuscripts might include practical diagrams alongside fantastical creatures, blending observation with imagination. The artistic techniques employed in marginalia reveal high skill despite their apparent spontaneity. Artists worked primarily in pen and ink, adding colour with washes or full pigments, depending on the manuscript's budget. Gold leaf might highlight important marginalia in luxury books. The flowing lines and confident strokes visible in the best marginalia show practiced hands. These weren't amateur doodles but professional art, even when depicting crude subjects. Pattern books circulated among workshops, explaining why certain marginal images appear across multiple manuscripts. Yet individual artists' styles remain identifiable, their personal quirks and preferences evident in their marginal creations. Women's involvement in manuscript production, including marginalia, is documented but often overlooked. Convents house scriptoria, where nuns copied texts and possibly added marginal decoration. Female patronage influenced marginal programs. Books of hours made for noble women often featured margins filled with flowers, birds, and domestic scenes, rather than combat or crude humour. Some marginalia depicts women at various activities, spinning, reading, teaching children, providing glimpses into medieval women's lives. The question of whether women artists created some of the more risque marginalia remains open, challenging assumptions about medieval gender roles. The production of marginalia involved planning, despite its spontaneous appearance. Luxury manuscripts show careful integration between text, major illuminations, and marginal decoration. Artists sketched designs in lead point before inking, and these preliminary drawings sometimes survive where ink has faded. The best marginalia responds to adjacent text. A passage about gluttony might feature a marginal scene of excessive feasting. This integration required literacy and planning, not just artistic skill. Workshop practices meant senior artists might sketch compositions for apprentices to complete, explaining varying quality within single manuscripts. Modern interest in medieval marginalia has exploded with digitization projects, making manuscripts accessible online. No longer do researchers need special permissions to view these treasures in person. High-resolution imaging reveals details invisible to naked eyes, underdrawings, scraped-away images, faded text. Digital Humanities projects catalogue and analyse marginalia across thousands of manuscripts, revealing patterns impossible to discern through individual study. Crowdsourcing projects enlist public help in transcribing marginal notes and identifying obscure images. The internet age has brought unexpected recognition to medieval marginalia. Images of knights fighting snails become viral memes. Twitter accounts devoted to medieval art attract millions of followers. The seemingly modern humour, visual puns, absurdist scenarios, social satire resonates with contemporary audiences. This popular interest has benefits and drawbacks. More people appreciate medieval culture's richness and complexity, but context gets lost in social media's rapid circulation. A complex theological allegory becomes simply medieval artist draws weird thing. Conservation challenges plague marginalia, often executed in iron gall ink, which turns brown and eats through parchment over time. Marginal drawings face particular risks. They occupy the edges of pages, the area most handled and damaged. Trimming during rebinding has destroyed countless marginal images. Water damage affects edges first. Even well-meaning conservation can threaten marginalia. 19th century restorers sometimes cleaned manuscripts by scraping away offensive images. Modern conservation prioritizes preserving all historical evidence, including marginalia once dismissed as defacement. Museums and libraries face challenges in presenting marginalia to public audiences. Traditional displays showing single openings can't convey the cumulative effect of margins filled with hundreds of images. Digital displays allow scrolling through entire manuscripts, but lose the tactile experience of turning pages. Exhibitions must balance scholarly interpretation with accessibility, explaining medieval contexts without overwhelming visitors. The humour helps. Everyone understands a visual joke, even across centuries. But deeper meanings require explanation of medieval culture, symbolism, and book production methods. Scholarly debates about marginalia's meaning continue evolving. Early researchers dismissed marginalia as meaningless decoration or scribal whimsy. Mid-20th century scholars like Lillian Randall catalogued and categorized, establishing marginalia as legitimate study objects. Current scholarship applies diverse methodologies: art historical analysis, social history, gender studies, digital humanities, revealing new interpretations. The question of audience remains crucial. Who saw these margins? Wealthy patrons who commissioned books, clergy using them for services, later readers across centuries. Each audience might interpret the same image differently. The relationship between text and margin in medieval manuscripts offers lessons about reading, meaning, and cultural production. Medieval readers engaged actively with their books, adding notes, responses, and images. The margin provided space for dialogue, with the text, with future readers, with oneself. This interactive approach contrasts with modern print culture's fixed texts. Digital media returns us to something like medieval textuality, comments, links, and modifications, creating layered, evolving documents. Medieval marginalia reminds us that books have always been social objects, not just information containers. What do these marginal images tell us about medieval society? First, that medieval people had senses of humour remarkably similar to ours. They enjoyed slapstick, satire, wordplay, and yes, toilet humour. Second, that religious culture allowed more room for playfulness than often assumed. Sacred and profane coexisted more comfortably than in later periods. Third, that artists found ways to express individuality and commentary even within highly conventionalized forms. Fourth, that medieval manuscripts were living documents, growing and changing through use. Fifth, that visual culture carried meanings we're still working to decode. The knight and snail combats remain mysterious, their original meaning perhaps irrecoverable. But that mystery itself teaches us humility about historical interpretation. We can catalogue, analyse, and theorise, but some aspects of past cultures remain foreign. Medieval marginalia preserves jokes we don't get, symbols we can't decode, and concerns we don't share. Yet it also shows us humans delighting in the absurd, complaining about work, mocking authority, and finding beauty in unexpected places. The monks who drew battling snails and defecating dragons were separated from us by centuries, but united by common humanity. As you finish your tea and reflect on this journey through medieval margins, Consider what future historians might make of our marginal spaces, our social media posts, our bathroom graffiti, our desk doodles during boring meetings. What will they understand? What will puzzle them? Medieval marginalia reminds us that official culture never tells the whole story. The margins, literal and metaphorical, preserve voices otherwise silenced, jokes otherwise forgotten, and art otherwise dismissed. In valuing these marginal additions, we recover a richer, funnier, more human Middle Ages. The manuscript closes, its margins dancing with grotesques and drolleries, snails and knights, monks and monsters. Each image represents a moment when a medieval artist chose play over piety, humour over solemnity, individuality over conformity. Their choices, preserved in ink and pigment, breach the centuries to remind us that humans have always been more than their official roles. The scribe who drew a snail defeating a knight made us a gift, not just of laughter, but of recognition. In the margins of their world we glimpse our own humanity reflected, distorted perhaps like a marginalia grotesque, but recognisable nonetheless. The margins matter because that's where the masks slip, where the human breaks through the institutional, where the individual voice sings out from the chorus. Long may the snails battle the knights in the margins of our imagination.